rain cut through the empty streets of Silver Ridge like a blade, carrying with it the kind of cold that settled deep into bones and refused to leave. It was Christmas Eve, though you wouldn't know it by looking around. No laughter filled the air. No lights glowed warmly from windows. Just silence, broken only by the distant creak of loose wood and the low whistle of winter pressing against a town that had forgotten how to celebrate. Inside a small, worn-down cabin at the edge of town, Emily Carter sat curled near the dying embers of a fire that had long since lost its strength. Her hands trembled slightly as she held them close to what little warmth remained, her breath visible in the freezing air. She hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, not because she didn't want to, but because there was nothing left. The last piece of bread had been gone that morning. The small sack of flour she had stretched for weeks now sat empty in the corner. And the coins she once had were spent long ago, traded for survival in a place that had no mercy for the weak. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to stop the cold. Her eyes drifted toward the small wooden table where a single candle flickered weakly, its light barely enough to push back the darkness. Christmas Eve, she thought bitterly. Once it had meant something. Once there had been warmth, voices, and the smell of food filling a home that felt alive. But that life had ended the day her father never came back from the hills. After that, the world had slowly taken everything else. Friends stopped visiting. Neighbors stopped asking if she was all right. And the town simply moved on, as if she had become part of the background, just another quiet shadow no one needed to notice. A sharp gust rattled the door, making her flinch slightly. She glanced toward it, her heart tightening for a brief second before settling again. No one came here. No one ever did. She had learned not to expect it. Slowly, she leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes as exhaustion pulled at her. Hunger had a way of doing that, making everything feel heavier, slower, harder to fight. Maybe she would sleep. Maybe that would make it easier to forget the ache in her stomach, the cold, the loneliness. But just as her eyes began to close, a knock echoed through the cabin, soft but clear. Emily's eyes snapped open instantly. She didn't move at first, didn't even breathe. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. The wind had been loud, the night had been restless. But then it came again. Knock. Knock. Louder this time. Real. Her heart began to race, her body tensing as she slowly pushed herself up from the floor. No one knocked on her door. No one even came near it. Fear crept in first. Out here, a knock at night didn't always mean something good. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the small iron poker near the fireplace. Her hand moved toward it, gripping it tightly as she stood. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice weaker than she wanted it to be. Silence followed for a second. Then a voice answered, low, steady. "Someone who saw your fire go out." Emily frowned slightly, confusion mixing with caution. Saw her fire? That didn't make sense. No one passed by this part of town unless they had a reason, and she hadn't given anyone a reason in a long time. "I don't have anything," she said quickly, her grip tightening on the poker. "If you're looking for money or food, you won't find it here." A pause, then the voice again. "Good," the man replied, "because I'm not here to take anything." That didn't make her feel better. If anything, it made her more unsure. Slowly, carefully, she stepped closer to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "Then why are you here?" she asked. Another brief silence, then, "Because no one should be alone tonight." The words landed differently, not threatening, not demanding, just simple. And somehow that made them harder to ignore. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering near the latch. Every instinct told her to be careful, to keep the door closed. But another part of her, the part that had been cold and hungry and alone for far too long, whispered something else. Slowly she slid the latch free and opened the door just enough to see. The man standing outside was tall, his coat dusted with snow, his hat pulled low against the wind. A horse stood behind him, its breath visible in the cold air. In his hand he held something wrapped in cloth. Food. Emily's eyes flickered to it immediately before she could stop herself. The man noticed. Of course he did. But he didn't comment on it, didn't smile, didn't judge. He simply stood there waiting. "You're freezing," he said after a moment. It wasn't a question. Emily straightened slightly, trying to regain some control over the situation. "I'm fine," she replied quickly. He didn't argue, didn't push. Instead, he slowly extended the bundle in his hand toward her. "Take it," he said, "before it gets cold." Her eyes moved between his face and the food, uncertainty written clearly in her expression. "Why?" she asked again, her voice softer now. "Why would you do this?" The man's gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. "Because I can," he said simply. That wasn't the answer she expected. It wasn't enough. Not really. But something about the way he said it made it feel honest. Emily hesitated for one last second. Then slowly she lowered the poker and reached out, taking the bundle from his hand. It was warm, warmer than anything she had touched in days. Her fingers tightened around it instinctively. "You should eat," he said. She nodded faintly, though she didn't move right away. Something else held her there, a question she hadn't asked yet. "You're not from here," she said quietly. He shook his head. "Passing through." Another pause. The wind picked up again, sending a sharp gust between them. Emily shivered, the cold cutting through her thin shawl once more. The man noticed. Of course he did. He stepped back slightly, glancing toward the inside of the cabin before looking at her again. "You going to stand there all night?" he asked. There was no pressure in his voice, just a simple observation. Emily blinked, caught off guard. Then before she could think too much about it, she stepped aside. "It's not much," she said quietly, "but you can come in." He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him as the storm pressed harder against the outside world. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cabin felt smaller with him in it. Not in a bad way, just different. Warmer, somehow. He removed his hat slowly, setting it near the door before glancing around the room. His eyes took in everything, the empty shelves, the weak fire, the thin blanket. He didn't say anything about it, but she knew he saw it. "You can sit," Emily said, gesturing toward the small chair near the table. He nodded once, taking the seat without comment. She moved back toward the fire, unwrapping the bundle with careful hands. The smell hit her instantly, fresh bread, a bit of meat, something warm and real. Her stomach tightened painfully in response. She hesitated only for a second before taking a small bite, then another. The relief was immediate, overwhelming in a way she hadn't expected. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth settle in. When she opened them again, she noticed he wasn't eating. He was just watching. Not in a strange way, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, just quietly. "You're not having any?" she asked, her voice softer now. He shook his head. "It's yours." Emily frowned slightly. "You brought it." "And I gave it," he replied. Simple. Final. She didn't argue. Instead, she tore off a small piece and held it out to him. "Then share it," she said. He looked at her hand for a moment, then at her face. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly, enough to notice. Slowly, he reached out and took it. "Fair enough," he said. The fire crackled softly between them as the storm raged outside, the small cabin holding a quiet moment neither of them had expected to find that night. Two strangers, one cold night, and something beginning to change. The fire crackled softly between them as the storm pressed harder against the cabin walls. But inside, the cold no longer felt as sharp. Emily sat closer to the fire now, the warmth of the food slowly returning strength to her body, though her hands still trembled slightly. Not from hunger this time, but from something unfamiliar. Presence. She wasn't alone anymore. The man sat across from her, quiet, composed, as if he belonged in silence more than conversation. He hadn't said his name, hadn't asked for hers, and yet somehow the space between them didn't feel empty. It felt steady. Emily glanced at him briefly before looking back at the fire. "You didn't have to stop," she said softly. "Most people wouldn't." He didn't answer immediately. His gaze rested on the flickering flames for a moment before shifting back to her. "Most people didn't see the fire go out," he replied. She frowned slightly. "That's not a reason." He tilted his head just a fraction, as if considering her words. "It was enough." Emily let out a small breath, not quite satisfied with that answer, but not pushing further either. She had learned long ago that some people spoke less, not because they had nothing to say, but because they chose their words carefully. And he seemed like that kind of man. "What's your name?" she asked after a moment. A pause, then, "Daniel." The name fit him. Simple, solid. "I'm Emily," she said quietly. He nodded once. "I figured." That caught her attention. "How?" He gestured faintly toward the small shelf near the wall. She followed his gaze and realized her father's old carving sat there, the one with her name etched roughly into the wood. She gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile. "Right." Silence returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the door with enough force to make her glance toward it instinctively. Daniel noticed. "It'll hold," he said. She nodded, though her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her shawl. "It always does," she replied, but there was hesitation in her voice. He stood then, moving toward the door with calm, deliberate steps. He checked the latch, pressed his hand briefly against the wood as if testing its strength, then stepped back. "It'll hold," he repeated, this time with quiet certainty. Emily watched him, something easing in her chest at the way he said it. Not just reassurance, but confidence, the kind that made you believe it. She looked back at the fire, her voice softer now. "You're not like the others." Daniel didn't react right away. "There aren't many others I care to be like," he said. A small silence followed. Then Emily spoke again, more carefully this time. "People don't come here," she admitted. "Not anymore." "Why?" he asked. She hesitated. The answer wasn't complicated, but it wasn't easy either. "Because there's nothing here," she said finally. "Nothing to gain." Daniel glanced around the cabin again, the empty shelves, the worn furniture, the thin blanket. "I see something," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "What?" He met her gaze, steady and calm. "Someone's still fighting to stay." The words hit harder than she expected. Emily looked away quickly, blinking as something unfamiliar tightened in her chest. She wasn't used to being seen like that. Not anymore. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "I know enough," he replied. Another pause. Then after a moment, she let out a small breath. "You talk like someone who's lost something too." Daniel's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "I have," he said simply. She didn't ask what. Some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Time passed slowly after that. The fire burned lower, but Daniel added wood without being asked, keeping the warmth alive. Emily noticed the small things, the way he moved without wasting effort, the way he watched the room without seeming restless, the way his silence didn't feel empty but protective. At some point, she found herself speaking again. "Why are you really here?" she asked softly. He glanced at her. "I told you." "No," she said, shaking her head slightly. "You gave me a reason, not the truth." That made him pause. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to the fire. I was passing through, he said, heading somewhere that didn't matter much. Emily frowned faintly. And? And I saw a light go out, he continued. Figured I'd check. She studied him. That still sounds like a reason. He looked at her again. This time there was something more direct in his gaze. Maybe I was tired of riding past things that needed stopping for, he said. The honesty in his voice settled deep. Emily didn't respond right away. She simply nodded slowly, accepting it for what it was. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind no longer striking the cabin with the same force. Inside, the quiet deepened, but it was warmer now, steadier. Emily shifted slightly, pulling her shawl closer as she looked toward the small window. It's Christmas Eve, she said after a moment. Daniel followed her gaze. Yeah. Used to mean something, she added. Family, food, voices, a pause. Now it's just another night. Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened. I stopped expecting it to feel different, she said quietly. Easier that way. Another silence followed. Then Daniel stood again, moving toward his coat. Emily watched him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. You're leaving? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled something out. Small, wrapped in cloth like the food had been. He walked back toward the table and set it down gently in front of her. Emily looked at it, confused. What's this? He shrugged slightly. Something I was carrying. She hesitated, then slowly unwrapped it. Inside was a small wooden carving, simple but carefully made. A star, not perfect, but real. Her breath caught slightly. I made it a while back, he said. Didn't have a place for it. Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Why give it to me? He met her gaze, his voice steady. Because you should have something tonight. The words were simple, but they meant more than anything else he could have said. Emily swallowed, her fingers tightening slightly around the small wooden star. For a moment, she didn't trust herself to speak. Then quietly, thank you. Daniel nodded once as if that was enough. The fire flickered softly, the storm now little more than a distant whisper. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Christmas didn't feel empty. It felt shared. Emily looked down at the star again, then back at him. You said you were passing through, she said. He nodded. Yeah. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice softer now. You don't have to leave tonight. The offer hung in the air, fragile but real. Daniel studied her for a moment, as if weighing something unseen. Then slowly, he nodded. All right. The word was quiet, but it changed everything. Because this time, when the night settled in around them, she wasn't alone. And this time, neither was he.